I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you for that lovely Ann Arbor, Michigan. So I know what it means when there's a beautiful day this time of year. So thank you for being in here instead of being outside. I want to talk today about cultures, selves, and the idea that when our selves match our cultures, we are likely to experience a sense of belongingness, and when they don't, we are likely to experience a lack of belongingness and show relatively poor performance and poor well-being. Setting that up, let me start first with cultures. All of us interact with many cultures in a given day and, of course, across our lives. We are born into some of them, including our nationality, gender, race, ethnicity, region of the country, religion, social class. Other cultures we pick up along the way, for example, by getting a college education, by choosing a particular career, or living in one type of neighborhood or another. Those are all sources and forms of culture. Our cultures are important because we are, as humans, culture-bearing, culture-making, culture-sharing beings. Our cultures provide for us guides for how to think, feel, and act. And although other primates have the rudiments of culture, no one has and does culture like Homo sapiens. Your special cocktail of cultures, and each of us has a somewhat different mix than the next, along with your biology, makes you you. So this you, this self, for a quick definition, because I'm going to talk about it all through the talk, is a sense of being a more or less enduring single agent who acts and reacts to the world around you, the world within you, and it's the part of you that perceives, that attends, thinks, feels, wants, learns, imagines, remembers, decides, and acts in all sorts of other ways. It's critical. You can't do without one because your self connects your past to your present to your future, helps you know that the person that went to bed last night is the same person who got up this morning. I have that sense most of the time anyway. It also, very importantly, is an integrating, organizing mechanism. It helps you make meaning out of your experience. It tells you what to attend to in the vast stimulus array that is the world out there, and it helps you figure out what to do next. And although most of us, most of the time, have an overriding sense of ourself as a pretty much the same self across time, places, and situations, when we look more closely at ourselves, and I want us to do that today, we can see that there are actually many different selves within our one self. And organizing claim that most of those selves that make up ourselves, those many selves, sort into two basic styles of selves. And here they are. Independent selves construe themselves as individual, unique, influencing others and their environments, free from constraints, and free to choose according to their preferences, and equal to others, of course, till proven better through their own efforts. Now, in contrast, the other big category of selves I'm suggesting is independent selves. And independent selves construe themselves as relational, as similar to others, as adjusting to their situations, as rooted in traditions and obligations, and ranked in hierarchies. Both of these are good and viable ways to be a self, and I would submit that every one of us uses both of these selves in one situation or another, and our various cultures foster one self or another. And that's why most of us use both of them even in a single day. So let me give you an example of what I mean. So this is a summary table from the recent book that Lynn Cooper mentioned, called Clash with my colleague Elena Connor. And From this summary table, I want you to look at the first row of the table, and if we think of culture in terms of hemispheres, the West tends to foster an independent construal of self, the East a more interdependent construal. When you think of the second row, take gender as a form of culture, being a man and what's required, the norms for men foster independence, and the norms and requirements and obligations of being a woman tend to foster a more interdependent way of being a self. Being white, being middle class, or living on one of the coasts of the US is likely to foster independence, while being a person of color, by being working class in the US, or living in the Midwest or the South is more likely to foster an interdependent construal of the self. Going down the rows here, we'll get to religion, another important cultural form that impacts us. Being mainline Protestant or non-religious is likely to foster a more independent self. Being conservative Protestant, Catholic, or Jewish is more likely to foster an interdependent take on the self. Being in business or being an entrepreneur, now we're talking about workplace culture, down on the 7th row here, is likely to foster an independent self. Being working engaged in a not-for-profit or being in government is more likely to require and foster an interdependent self. And finally, if we look at divide the world, global south, global north, which is really the economic equator, which is basically in the world the haves versus the have-nots, the global north is likely to foster, to promote an independent sense of self, while the global south is more likely to promote an interdependent self. Now, this is a lot of just spelling out the framework to illustrate the complex and dynamic process by which our cultures shape ourselves, and vice versa, and also how a mismatch between culture and self means trouble for belongingness. I'm going to focus on social class culture in the US, and so I'm going to try to take us through the whole dynamic process, but I wanted to put it all into the overall framework. Most of the research in the social sciences, and that's true for psychology, that's true for economics, sociology, anthropology, most of this work focuses on people who inhabit middle-class European American contexts. We often don't mark it as such, but that's the case. Until quite recently, as social psychologists, we haven't focused on people in working class contexts at all, and how this your class context will shape your way of being a self. And this, it turns out, is fairly significant gap in our knowledge, because most people in the United States are working class, and the most critical problems we have to solve as a society, problems of education, of employment, of government, of health, will involve negotiating the large and growing social class divide that characterizes our society. Now, I think my own interest in social class began when I was teaching in Ann Arbor a small seminar, and as part of the requirement, every student had to come for an office hour. I knew from past experience that if I just told students to come for an office hour, they would avoid it, because who wants to spend an hour talking with the professor? It sounds kind of terrifying to most students, if not boring. So they wouldn't do it, so I made it a requirement. So I remember the one day I was looking, 3 o'clock, no Josh, who was signed up, and then finally I got up and opened the door and went outside down the hall. There was Josh, and he was waiting. So I invited him to come in. I had noticed that many students, show up, knock on the door, or just come in when it's their time. He waited to be invited in, and I asked him how the class was going, and he said, well, the class he thought was okay. He was learning a lot, and he had done well on his papers. But he said, all of a sudden he just burst out, and he said, but the talking thing, I know it's a requirement, but where do those students get all those ideas and opinions anyway? And I thought it was a really good question. It turned out to be the best question that anyone had asked me. I required class participation, but he didn't feel that he had a lot of ideas and opinions, and he didn't have them to offer, and he was really curious about them. turned out, I found out later, that Josh came from the thumb of Michigan, a relatively poor part of the state, and he was indeed the first person in his family to go to college. And at that time, I was involved in looking at hemisphere differences, making east-west comparisons in self, and I really hadn't thought anything about social class at all. And I think when he said this to me, I said something kind of distinctly unhelpful, like, well, just speak up. Just put your hand up and start talking, because it seemed to me that's what a lot of the other students did. They put their hand up and then words came out of their mouth. And he was he didn't, I could tell that was not a satisfactory answer. But that was, I think, the seeds of thinking about the way social class experience, especially social class as indexed by your level of educational attainment and the educational attainment of your parents, could make a really big difference for your behavior. Now, I think that in the last 5 years, there's been a burst of interest within social psychology on inequality and the way inequality shapes behavior. And I think this isn't surprising, because as a society, we've had to come to terms with inequality. We're more unequal than we've ever been before. Just a few slides to remind you, they've been all over the place. The top richest 10% of the population holds 80% of the nation's financial wealth. That's in blue. So the top 10% holds 80%. You can see what's wrong with this picture. The bottom 80% of the population, that means everybody else, holds only 7% of the nation's wealth. Another way to look at our inequality is to look at pay since 1990, and you can see the top line there, the blue line, is CEO pay, has increased dramatically. Production worker pay, which is in the green there, has gone up only slightly over this 15, 16-year period. Minimum wage, the orange line on the bottom, has barely moved since 1990. So you see where the inequality has come from, and it's almost unbelievable. You can't look at these slides too many times. It's kind of surprising, shocking. Okay, median weekly earnings for high school graduates and college graduates. You can see that for college graduates right now, this is 2012 data, is $1,158 compared to $641 for high school graduates, so approximately double. College graduate will earn, depends on the figures, but more than $1 million more than a high school grad over the course of a lifetime. And one of the most important things about this is what I said before, is the proportion of the US population with a college degree, 27.5%. So I think most of us, when we operate in these college-educated worlds, we assume that most people are college-educated, but in fact, it is not the case, and that's what I mean when I say that we are a working-class nation, and we really have to understand more about behavior in contexts other than our own. Another interesting figure on inequality is that the United States now ranks 101st in terms of inequality in the nation. India, China, Iran have less inequality than in the US. We're actually 34 out of the 34 Western democracies in terms of social mobility. And of course, we once were the leaders in terms of moving up from your starting position. So it's clear that we are unequal. And so as social psychologists, I think a good question for us to ask ourselves is, what do we know about hierarchies and ranks and how they influence behavior? And it turns out that we know a fair amount. And so drawing on this was in our group, our first way of thinking. Let's take what we know and then think what it would mean to be chronically at a higher or a lower position in social rank, which is what social class indicates. So now, hierarchies are pervasive. We're not going to avoid them. All animals are sensitive to status. If you put 5 people in a room and come back in 10 minutes, a hierarchy will have formed. It's just human behavior. We tend towards hierarchy. And we don't just put ourselves into hierarchies. We then build our worlds according to those hierarchies, so our worlds reflect them and continue to promote those hierarchies. So just a quick summary of what do we know from the experimental literature, and this is literature on power and hierarchy. There's been a lot of it in the past 10 years or so. What do we know about the difference in behavior, top and bottom of the hierarchy? First of all, individual consequences. Those at the top of the hierarchy are more, these are all experimental studies, more creative, express their attitudes and opinions more, they take more risk, they negotiate better deals, they're more analytic, they take more control, they pursue and implement their goals, they go for the gist, and they make abstractions. So that's summarizing across a lot of literature. There's also a variety of interpersonal consequences of being at the top of the hierarchy. You're more likely to judge others' transgressions more harshly than your own, so you think you're special. You're less influenced by norms, you lie more, you cheat more, and you show less empathy to other people. So a clear set of stuff that goes from being at the top. What about those at the bottom? It's almost, but not a complete mirror image, because all the studies haven't been done. But at the bottom of the hierarchy, you're going to conform more, perform less well on all kinds of tasks, take less control, perceive less choice, pay more attention to the context, experience deficits in working memory, inhibition, and planning, executive control. Interpersonal consequences, there's some good stuff, showing more empathy to your peers, more sensitive towards others' emotional experiences, and more oriented towards the collective good. And what's I think most fascinating about this is that these effects occur regardless of the source of power. So it could be objective in the sense of people who have more education or more money than others, but also you can get these effects by priming, just by getting people to say, imagine a time where you had control over other people. So imagining yourself at the top of the hierarchy, or imagine a time when other people had control over you. So just by going through the simulation, you can produce these differences in behavior, or you can have a ladder like this that Nancy Adler and her colleagues do, and you mark an X on which rung you think represents where you stand in society. If you think you're near the top of your ladder, for whatever reason in your community, however you define community, you think you're near the top, you'll show behaviors that are akin to those at the top of the hierarchy. If you feel you're near the bottom of the hierarchy in your particular community, however you define it, you'll show behavior that looks more like those at the bottom. So given that we know that we can get these differences in behavior, and we can get them pretty quickly, it seemed like a good starting point to think about what these chronic differences in societal rank might be. What might we expect for people who've spent more of their time at the top of the hierarchy versus people who had spent more time lower down in the hierarchy. And it also suggests, though, the fact that you can manipulate this suggests that we can arrange situations such that people, if you give people more power or more authority, or you give them a sense of entitlement, that's an important route to change in their behavior. I'm suggesting it might not be hard. These differences I'm going to talk about are not fixed or essential. We can change them by changing the culture. In the studies I'm going to talk about today, and this is what is commonly done in the literature today, middle class is defined by having a 4-year degree or more. Working class, less than a 4-year degree, or having, in the case of students, we call students middle class if they have one parent who's completed college, and if they have no parents who have completed college, then we call them working class. You can index class in a variety of ways, but education is a quite good proxy for it. So back to what I was saying in the beginning. All of us as humans, we create and maintain distinctions. These are some of them, the ones I've talked about: social class, ethnicity, race, gender, geographical origin. We don't have to cut up the world in that way. We could use other categories. It's just that those are ones that we have used as humans. The ideas, the practices, the institutions, that's what we're calling cultures, associated with these distinctions then shape the self, and the self in turn shapes thinking, feeling, and acting. And as I said, each of us are multicultural. Another way to capture it, think about culture in terms of 4 I's. So over here we've got individuals, or I's, as in I's and me, but you can't understand behavior unless you put that I, that individual, in the whole sociocultural complex, which includes daily interactions with other people and with various products, the institutions that structure those daily interactions are a very important part of culture, and then the big ideas about what's good and true and right that are true for every culture. There's a Mizzou way of doing things, and there's a Stanford way of doing things, and there's a University of Michigan way of doing things. We all have ideas and norms and values about the right way to do things that are then inscribed in our institutions, that then show up in our everyday interactions, and then shape ourselves. So the important part I want to make here, though, is that individuals are culture making. We don't just get shaped and sit there. We then feed these cultures through our actions. Many times we're just reinforcing our cultures, or we're mirroring them, but often we can, through our actions, change the culture too. Cultures are products of human activity, and if we want to change those cultures, there's nothing magical about it. We can do it. Compared to middle class contexts, what do we know? The literature tells us a variety of things. People in working class contexts have obviously lower income, less geographic mobility. Why is that? People with high school educations tend to stay where they've grown up to work. So that means that and that has consequences for their social network. That means that most of the people they know are people they've known for their whole lives and who've known them for their whole lives. If you go to college, very often you go away to college, that means your social network changes. Your social network is filled with people who were strangers and who you voluntarily choose, you volitionally choose to be friends with. There are friendships of your own, of your relationships of your own making. If you don't go away to college, you have more interaction with your family. If you go away to college, the people you interact with more are likely to be friends and acquaintances, people that you have chosen. Very different parenting styles in working class versus middle class contexts. I'll talk more about that in a minute. Of course, different jobs, and the jobs that you can get with a high school education mean that you're going to have jobs with limited choice, control, and decision authority. Of course, worse health, shorter lifespan. These are, the data are very powerful on this. And also, I would argue you have different selves. And as I set up in the beginning, to the extent that you are in college-educated contexts, you yourself have a college education or you've grown up with a college education, you are likely to have been in cultures that are fostering an independent self, an independent way of being. If you've grown up in high school educated context, working class context, you are more likely to have had practice being an interdependent self. And in this diagram, I've sketched them out in another way. From an independent sense of self, what's important is what's inside the blue there. I mean, what's inside you, your attributes, your goals, your attitudes, your opinions, that stuff that Josh was wondering what people had. That's the focus of independent self. If you have a more interdependent self, the focus is the dashed red line there, which is your relationships with other people. That's the main difference between these two, a focus on you as a separate individual versus a focus on you as a set of relationships that make you up. These cultural models are not just in your head. These aren't just attitudes that you have. They can be in your head in terms of values and schemas that you carry around, but they're also, and what I importantly want to emphasize is that these different models are built into our world. So you may not be aware of these different ways of acting at all. It's just that some contexts foster an independent way of being. They require an independent way of being. Others foster a more interdependent way. If you're in a low-resourced environment, which many working class environments are, you have to be more socially responsive to others. You have to adjust your behavior. You depend on other people. They depend on you. You need to pay attention to those relationships. It's necessary with more limited resources for survival. When you have more, it's easier to be an independent self, or to operate off of that self. But the point I want to make is these models don't have to be available for conscious reflection. You don't have to be able to report them on a questionnaire. You may, but often you don't. But they're like water to the fish. You can find their imprint in our worlds in all sorts of institutional practices and policies and everyday interactions. And just by living in those worlds, one or another self is fostered and promoted. Now, in our work, what we've tried to do is look for evidence of these different ways of being a self, both out in the world and in the head. And let me give you some examples of that. Starting first with, this is the 4 eyes sort of filled out, starting with the institutions box. And there's all sorts of institutions that make up our culture: political institutions, media, legal, educational institutions, the military. All of these institutions are part of our cultures and can be analyzed for how they foster oneself or another. Let me start with media as an institution that's particularly powerful in conveying these ideas about what's the right kind of self in a particular context. So in one study, we analyzed the ads on in magazines that were targeted either to college-educated readers or magazines targeted to high school-educated readers, just to see what sorts of images were prevalent and what images about the right way to be. So here's an example of an ad that's targeted to an audience, a college-educated audience. And what do you see here? Here is the implicit and the explicit message is that what's the source of happiness? It's being alone with your playlist. And of course, your playlist is a product of your own free choice. And the themes that advertisers use here are important because they know that they want to associate their product with a way that corresponds to how you would like to feel. And they therefore perpetuate these ideas of what's good and what's self. Here's an ad from a magazine targeted to high school educated readers, and it's the people look happy, as the person did in the last ad, but the difference is you see people together, you see a family, you see it's a family feeling, there's food, they're enjoying things together. It's a much more it's a very different message of the right way to be. The right way to be is connected, interdependent, adjusting to the others. When you analyze over 1,600 ads, which we did here for the themes, you can see that in the middle panel here, in the ads targeted to the college-educated audiences, these were the common themes. Productivity, attractiveness, affluence, and choice were the big themes that come out of the ads. When you look at the ads that are targeted to high school educated readers, you see a very different set of themes. You see themes about eating and drinking, things about family, things about illness avoidance like Advil and Tylenol and pain relief. And then you see a lot of themes that are talking about feeling good. So within the same mainstream American culture, we are promoting different ideas about the right way to be through magazines. We have similar studies with websites that confirm these differences in the messages about what's the right way to be well. If I move to the next box here, interactions box, your daily interactions in home and school and workplace and religious spaces, that's a good place to consider the child-rearing practices that are different by social class. And let me give you an example from work done by Adri Kusaro, who is an anthropologist, and she looked at mothers talking to children in a lower working class community in Queens and then in an upper middle class community on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. And she reports on the conversations. So here's one mother saying, you have to give them a very strong background, principles, give them meanings, values, strong values about everything. You give them principles that they have to rely on, and you draw the line for them. If they have that, they know where they're going, where they're coming from. So a very strong idea that this is what parenting is about. What's right, what's wrong, what's the way to do things. So a much more interdependent view of self in the sense that you are aware of yourself in a hierarchy. You are aware of yourself as there are certain ways to behave and you better behave that way or you'll be in trouble. And that makes sense. Parenting in a less resourced working class context, it's a less structured, less safe context. If you get into trouble, there's likely to be more problems than if you're in a more resourced context. Look at a more resourced context of the Upper East Side. This mother says, my child, I treat her like an adult too much, like telling her the truth no matter what, but it gives her a certain status in the family, makes her feel like she's on an equal footing, that her feelings are important as anyone else's. So you see this mom is shaping up an independent self, a self that the individual is in charge, and this mom is not too worried about communicating to this kid where she is in the hierarchy, or that she has to pay attention to the rules or to the norms or be careful to behave. That's because it's easier to have this kind of self in a more affluent world. Lubrano was a journalist who wrote a book called Working Class Roots, Middle Class Dreams. It's called Limbo. And his father was a bricklayer, and he goes to school, he goes to Columbia, and he wants to become a journalist. And his father cannot believe it. What is this? What's this journalism thing? What's this college thing? Why isn't he going to come home and do the work that the family has done? So it's a great description of this clash of the two cultures. He says, in the working class, people perform jobs in which they are routinely, closely supervised and required to follow orders and instructions, so they bring their children up in a home in which conformity, obedience, and intolerance for backtalk are the norm, the same characteristics that make for a good factory worker. So you can see that these are conditions that are encouraging a more interdependent self, because that self fits the kinds of jobs and the kinds of situations that people with working class backgrounds are likely to have. And you often see that when it comes to work and family, people in working class contexts often see the middle class. They think that middle class people have their priorities completely screwed up. They think they're misplaced. For example, people from working class often think, you have to be responsible and do your work, but you shouldn't let your work define you. Family should define you. Maybe some of you have had those kinds of conflicts or know of them. Work, from a working class perspective, is a means to an end. It's often a way to put food on the table, support the family, but you put family above work. And family is a place where people have status, and it's more important than work. In the middle class, work is the path of self-development. And from a working class perspective, people often have disdain for sort of the self-focus of people in the middle class, or once people go to college, people develop this independent self, and from a working class perspective, it's like people are on about themselves all the time, and they think they're special and different. So there are really these two tensions, because both ways of being are important and different. Let me just quickly, there's so much on child rearing, but let me just summarize it quickly. In middle class worlds, the general idea is that as a middle class parent, you think of the world as welcoming, and so you encourage your child to develop an independent self. Standing out, being unique, different, separate is a good thing to do. In many middle class families, kids come home, everybody sits around the dinner table, everybody's asked, what did you learn today? Or what's new today? Or children are asked for their opinions. They're asked to participate in the family conversation. You can see this is what Josh, coming from a working class family, he hadn't had a lot of practice with this. Nobody was focusing on him and telling him the world was about him or he was special. Quite the difference. In the working class, the world is more uncertain, and its fitting in is important, and conformity and obedience are more important. Having a sense of yourself and how you're different is less important than having a sense of yourself as where you are in the hierarchy. And it has everything to do with money. If you've got money and you have resources, money can buy second chances. Working class children don't have this luxury, so they don't get this emphasis on developing and becoming a unique and special individual as much as people in the middle class do. There's less emphasis on the cultivation. Adri Kusserow talks about middle class parents as thinking about their children as hothouse flowers, that they should be cultivated so they can open out their petals into the world, their beautiful petals into the world. In working class context, there's much more a sense of your child is a weed. You're going to make that kid tough. If anyone steps on that kid, she'll be okay. She'll spring back up, because she's tough, she's resilient, she can take what the world has to offer. And that's a sensible strategy too. It all depends on which world you imagine you're preparing your child for. So now, moving over to the I box here, to individual identity I box. What kinds of evidence do we have that working class and middle class are really behaving differently as individuals? One study that I've been part of is a national sample of Americans, and this includes all kinds of survey measures as well as lots of open-ended data. And from this national sample, we've looked at self-descriptions. When you see the self-descriptions of college-educated Americans, they read like this. I think I have a lot of energy. I think I'm well organized. I think I'm smart. I don't think I'm brilliant, but I think I learn quickly. Not very physically inclined. I think I'm hot-headed and stubborn. So the specific attributes that are inside the independent self change from self-description to self-description. There's about 11 or 13 things, different things that Americans use to describe themselves with. And the form is the same, but the form is the same. They say about 4 or 5 positive attributes, and then at the end they come in with a couple of negative ones so they don't seem too conceited. But they're lazy, they procrastinate something. But basically this is the sense of self that comes from an independent self, if you've been in a context that's fostered that for you. So you see yourself as kind of special and different, and you know what qualities you have. When you look at the self-descriptions of people in working class contexts, you see a different emphasis. This man says, I think I'm not, if by a college degree, I think I'm not, if not by a college degree, an intelligent person. I have a strong belief in God. I know what's right and wrong. I'm kind to people. I treat people like I want to be treated. I never talk down to anyone. I never talk behind people's backs. So I think I'm pretty much an honest person. So fewer attributes that are mentioned, a self-description in terms of what I'm doing, actions and activities, and very clearly among working class, much more likely to mention other people, and also to mention 2 other things that we see here. People are aware of hierarchy. Hierarchy, and you're aware of your place in the hierarchy is important, and it's therefore important to observe that, and people don't like people who are disingenuous, who do one thing in one situation and another in another situation. That, from a working class perspective, that's what middle class people do. They change their attitudes and their opinions depending on who they're with. From a working class perspective, that is not okay. They know what's right or wrong, and they're a stable person, and they're the same way to everyone. You know, if they don't like someone, they'll tell you to your face. You don't go behind someone's back and talk about it. Also, because they're aware of hierarchy, they know that other people don't want to be talked down to, because that's really insulting to people, to be not treated as an equal. Those are not concerns for people who spend most of their time using their independent self. Let me give you a couple of other examples. From the study, we asked a large sample, what's important for having a good life? You can see that there are different ideas about what's reflecting the study with the ads, what's important for a good life. In the middle class, people say continual learning and growth, sense of purpose. It's this emphasis on developing my special and different self, sense of accomplishment. Over here, the working class talk about faith. This is in the US, enough money to meet basic needs, absence of illness, having a good job. So these different selves focus you on different concerns, and therefore different behaviors likely to follow. This woman says, what makes my life go well? So here you see this independent model coming from her mouth. I plan for the future. I make choices about what I want, feel, and want to be. I act on those choices. I face my fears and overcome them. Generally, when I'm feeling sad or blue, it's because I'm not facing my fears or taking time to make choices and act upon them. I'm going to show you in a minute that choice is critical, this sense of I am free to make choices. This is what's a signature of an independent self. From in a working class perspective, where you're more likely to see an interdependent self, this woman says, work hard, what's important for a good life, and share my wealth and happiness. Never say no to things or offers that will be good for me. Try to be open and honest. Once again, being honest, very important. Help others as much as possible. More focus on others. Be clean and neat. Be organized. Pay bills on time. Stay in touch with positive people. Love humankind no matter what. Pray. So focus on sharing, connecting, mentioning other people, fitting in, relationships. So the next thing we started to do is, these are kind of explicit models. We asked people in these different contexts, working class or middle class, what was important to them. Next, we've done a number of studies in the laboratory to see if in more implicit measures we would also see these differences. And in the laboratory, we took a particular focus on choice, because as you remember, one of the key features of an independent self is this freedom to choose. And in the US, there's probably nothing that's more important, I would say, to people and the way they talk about their lives, possibly with the exception of God, than choice. Choice is everywhere. And what we find, and especially because we've done a lot of studies comparing Americans with East Asians, Japanese, Taiwanese, Koreans, you see that working class Americans actually look more like East Asians many times in their responses because of this more interdependent self and a need to be more socially responsive. So if we just ask working class, middle class students, you can do it yourself. Think about the number of choices you made since you got up this morning. Okay, so just think about it. Start listing choices. So these are students in the exact same context. We ask them to list choices. What do we see? We see that the middle class students think they've made twice as many choices as the working class students. And when you look at, what choices, it seems like they're the same sort of thing. I decided a bagel instead of toast, blue shirt instead of white shirt. But it's just that in the middle class, there's this idea of you see the world in terms of choices. You see your actions as choices. And we've done other more controlled studies where you can see people constructing their actions in terms of choice. Then I've done a variety of other studies like this. So say, for example, under a guise of a marketing study, I show you these 5 pens, and I say, would you pick a pen you like and write with it, and then evaluate it, and then when you can have the pen. So say you pick one. Say you pick this pen right here, and you go to put your hand on it, and right as you say, I'll have this one, I either let you have it and write with it and evaluate it, or I say, no, you can't have that one, sorry, that's my last one. You'll have to have this one instead. So I set it up as a free choice, and then just when you're about to choose, I take your choice away. I usurp your choice. So the question is, who does that matter to? Well, what you can see, and this is pen liking, you can see that for the middle class, those people for whom their choice was taken away after they put their hand on it, they didn't get that pen, then they were given another pen. They still got a pen, but they got another pen, not the one they chose. They don't like that pen. They devalue, they downgrade that pen. But look over here, in the working class subjects don't show that same problem. They're happy that they got a pen. And the fact that they didn't get the one they wanted, oh well. And when you debrief with them after, they'll tell you, well, the person must have needed that pen for some reason. It's not a problem. In the middle class, we're with an independent self where people are used to developing preferences and then being able to express those preferences in behavior. If I take that away from you, take that choice away from you, it's very upsetting to people. In a lot of our studies, we've used a paradigm like this, in which we have people fill out a questionnaire, and then we say, oh, thanks so much for doing this. I'd like to give you a pen, and it has Stanford written on, and I hand them 5 pens clutched in my hand, 4 of one color and 1 of another color, or we vary the color. And what I know from this, from multiple studies, is that when we're using young Americans, college-educated Americans, European Americans always go for the pen that's unique, the pen color that stands out, the different pen. This is part of being an independent self. East Asian respondents, all sorts of East Asian respondents in all kinds of contexts, they want the pen that's common, the one that there's more of. And this is, we've replicated this many times. It's fitting in. They want to have the pen that more people will have. So then we thought, well, we've used this a lot. What about this in working class contexts? And what you see is that over here you replicate this pattern in the middle class in the US, where those with a college education like the minority pen, although not nearly as much as with just plain young students. But in the working class, you get a pattern that looks much more like the pattern that we see in East Asia. It's a pattern of wanting the common pen, the pen that allows me to fit in, the pen that there will be many of, the one that's common. So then we thought about that. Well, this is the pen. Could we do something else that's a little bit more substantial than a pen? What would we see? So we decided to have cars. We couldn't give away a car like Oprah, but we did a vignette. And we said, okay, imagine, this is a very California car, you're going to purchase a new car, and you do the research, you go out, you think about it for a long time, you go out and you buy a new car. Okay, here's your new car. And you show it to your friend, and then you find out the next day that your friend went out and bought the exact same car. Okay, this is choice again. This is someone making the exact choice as you. So I want, who wants to tell me how they feel?
Reminds me of the Volkswagen ads that are on right now. Have you seen them?
Oh, I think I know. Yeah, tell them.
It's basically that somebody shows up in the new Jetta and the neighbor starts praising the car and says, "Where did you get that? I think I'd like to get one." And the person says, "Oh no, this was the last one."
That's right. No, that's what it was. So he was telling me I have to look at it. I haven't seen it. So what we found, we looked at middle class respondents and working class respondents. So the middle class responses are exactly what you're saying. I'd be disappointed. I wanted to be unique and have this car for myself, independent self. But then he bought it, so it spoils my fun and my point of differentiation from everyone else. So this is what you would think. Working class respondents, completely different response, completely different idea about having the same pen or the same color car. I think it's cool, and if I were to go out and buy that car, I'd be like, yeah, let's start a car club. So if my buddy got it. It's just, and just so you don't think I'm cherry picking the data here, you can see that the working class respondents, they weren't bothered. They much more likely to feel happy if someone chooses the same as they. It's a sort of flattery. We'll be together. We'll have solidarity over our car. Once you've got this more independent self, every action is self-expressive. All your choices are revealing your unique and special identity. Okay, quick overview. So many things. I was trying to give you some quick glimpses of data that suggests that independent model of self, which is common in middle-class contexts, promotes self-expression, uniqueness, self-esteem, choice, control, influencing the others, the world, achievement, success, change, growth, potential, optimism, future orientation. This is where we tend to be in psychology. This is what we tend to think as human behavior. But in interdependent model of self, which is more common in the working class, we see a different set of behaviors, and we know less about them. Attention and adjustment to others, solidarity, empathy, sympathy, helping, resilience, persistence, self-reliance, being tough, this emphasis on respect, knowing your place in the hierarchy, discipline, vigilance, maintaining the moral order, knowing what's good and bad, and a focus on the integrity and consistency of the self. And this matters, these differences matter, because most of our institutions in the United States, and I'm going to use the university as an example, are built according to the middle class model of self. It's hidden, and we don't spell that out, but most of the time we assume that people are operating from an independent model of self. And when behavior matches that, that's fine. But if we see behavior that doesn't match that, then we're very quick to see that people are behaving differently. We often assume that's deficient. We think that's inferior. We often stigmatize it. A good example that we did some work on was what happened under Hurricane Katrina. The independent mainstream observers looking at that behavior said to themselves, why didn't those people just get up and get out of there? Well, that would be something to do if people had resources, if they had paycheck, if they had a car, if they didn't have to leave family behind. It took Bill Clinton, it was a week into it before someone said, not everybody has the resources to operate as an independent self, to make the choice to leave. Many people are much more constrained. They have a much more interdependent sense of self, and then they behave accordingly, which is staying and taking care of others. So what I want to do today to show how this could make a difference is to talk about these two selves in our very own institutions, the university, and I want to make the point that an unseen disadvantage for working class students in the university is that American university culture promotes independence, and this can work to undermine first generation students. And this is all kind of off the, it's off our radar screen for the most part, which matters because increasing numbers of first-generation students where neither parent has a four-year degree are going to college, and this became an issue at Stanford when we have now 25% of our students are first-gen students, but the university was recruiting students, but they weren't doing anything to think about whether the university was welcoming, was inclusive, was set up for first-gens who were likely, in our terms today, to come with more practice with their interdependent self and much less practice with this independent way of being, which is actually what the university requires in order to be successful. And in fact, the literature is very clear now that compared to first-generation continuing generation students, first-generation students have lower grades, they drop out more, they have smaller academic gains in their first year, they have many less feelings of belongingness, fewer close relationships with peers, and fewer relationships with professors. And what we argued is that what we see here is a cultural mismatch, a clash, in that the college is structured in terms of independence, but the first generation students are more likely to be operating off an interdependent sense of self. I can show you a few cultural products. This is that comes in the letter when Stanford students are accepted to school. For all the times you stayed up late and got it right, practiced, rehearsed, and gave it your all, took a risk instead of following the easy path, we applaud you. We look forward to the unique and extraordinary contribution that you will make to this campus. I mean, it's not enough that you're going to come to school and try and get a BA. You have to make a unique and extraordinary contribution to the campus. So it's a little terrifying if you're coming from an environment where nobody has gone to college before, you don't have a clue what college could be about, and you're going to make a unique, what is it about? What's the contribution? And it's, the same here at Mizzou. You can follow your lifelong dreams or figure out what you want to be when you grow up. With more than 280 degree programs, this assumes, of course, a huge amount of choice would be what everyone wants, offered by our diverse schools and colleges. Mizzou has something for everyone. You can even design your own program. Well, this is wonderful if you've come from a world where you've had a lot of practice doing things on your own, carving out your own path, going your own unique and special way. Great. But what about if you haven't, which is increasingly true? Then how does that feel? It feels probably not so good. So this is the Viewbook, and I'll just show you some other things in here, and you can go through your own materials. This just killed me. It's not the task, first and foremost, of an academic advisor to tell you what to do. God forbid. Your advisor should be seen as a compass, not a roadmap. So, this is fine, once again, if you've had college-educated parents and you know what college is all about, and there are people talking to you about what this and that and helping you make decisions. If you haven't had experience with college, what would be wrong with your advisor being a roadmap? With just saying, first you do this, you turn left, you turn right. At least for the first couple of years, it would make sense. But we're so blind to the fact that there are other ways to be, we don't see it. This is Stanford, just like you have. What's so good about Stanford? Extensive choice. Options include double majors, minors, individually designed majors, dual bachelor's, masters. This is all good if you know what to do with all this. But if you're coming to college and you're the first, you would like someone to say, here's a good major. This would be good for you, and it would be good for these potential careers, or here's some other majors that would be good, and here's the best way to get that major. And most importantly, when you're working in that major, if you don't know how to do things, get out and ask. Go ask for help. Don't sit in your room and try to figure it out yourself, which is what first-generation students routinely do. We've, just to suggest that, we did the 75 top rated universities in U.S. News and World Report, and we asked administrators, provosts, and deans, because we didn't want to just go with the assumption that they were, that the independent model was dominant. And you can see that the blue bars here, it's very clear that being independently motivated, working independently, conducting independent research, paving their own pathways, challenging norms and rules, developing personal opinions, that's what administrators say the whole point of college is. In the red is these more interdependent things, working collaboratively, following in the footsteps of accomplished others, considering the norms and rules. That's not what college is about from the administrator's point of view. So we had them as experts reflect on it's about. So if you've come from a working class context, you're going to have trouble doing these things right off because you haven't had as much practice with it as people from middle class. So, more than 70% characterize the university as independent. and only 9% characterized that as interdependent. Then we asked the students. What we've seen is students themselves, first gens are the red bars, continuing gens are the blue bars. And you can see that in every case, the continuing generation students, that means the students whose parents have college education, are more likely to say that my reasons for coming to college are to become an independent thinking, to learn more about my interests, to expand my understanding of the world, to expand my knowledge. But it's also the case that the first gens have that as well. They have those motives for coming to school. Being independent is people understand that that's what college is in some degree about. There's a significant difference, but still, the first gens have those motives. But where you see the big difference is when it comes to interdependent motives, the first generation students have this whole set of other things that they're doing that the continuing generation students are not so concerned with. So if you come from a working class context, you're likely to want to bring honor to your family, to be a role model for your community, to show others you can do well, to give back to your community, to provide a better life for children, to help your family after college. So the working class students have two sets of motives. And it's the college is good at letting you express the independent motives. There are ways to do it because college is set up for that. There are many fewer opportunities in college to deal with these interdependent motives that working class students bring. You know, I think now some service learning, and we're doing some other programs that will help students with this. But it's really, the working class are almost bicultural in this way. They have these two sets of things they want to do. So I want to, like in the next 4 or 5 minutes, finish up, but I want to show you a study that we did, and then an intervention. I have plenty of time for questions. So we took this letter that comes in the Stanford Viewbook. It's a letter from President Hennessy. And the letter that we send out to students now is very much in this independent direction. So it says, I'm delighted that you have decided to attend Stanford University, and you think Stanford is the right place for you. In the next few years, you can learn from your personal exploration and individual experiences as a student. It's very much focused on going out there and doing it as an independent person. So we took the letter, and we framed this, we call this the independent self condition or frame. And then we took the letter and we tweaked it in 4 different places in an interdependent condition. So President Hennessy says, I'm delighted you and your family have decided you should attend Stanford. And then down here it says, for the next few years, together with the Stanford community, you will have many opportunities to explore new areas, to learn from your experiences with your peers. So we are focusing on, here at Stanford, you could also operate from your interdependent self. And then, so we had one condition or another. We had 2 tasks. We had a difficult anagram task like this, where you have to, unscramble the words to make another word. And what we found, and we gave this to both first gens and continuing generation students, and we crossed it with the 2 letters, and we looked at problem solved. And what we found is a very clear difference. For the first generation students here, this red bar, they solved fewer problems when college had been framed as an independent activity, when the welcome letter they read was about being an independent self here at Stanford. You can see that when we framed college with the letter that said, here at the university you can work with others, we made mention of your family, we primed interdependence, you can see that there was no such difference in their performance. That was a verbal task. We also gave a puzzle, a nonverbal task, where you have to take these pieces and make one of those figures around the side with the puzzle pieces in the middle. And on this nonverbal task, we saw the exact difference. So when college was framed in the letter from President Hennessy as a place for you to work on your own, go your own way, be independent, the first generation students performed less well. This was, we believe, a threat to them in the sense that they felt that they don't know how to operate that way. That's not the way they've been used to operating, and they're worried that here at the university that's what's going to be required. As they're taking the test, they're worried about being seen through the stereotype of someone that the college is not for. You take that away by framing it in terms of interdependence, you get much better performance. It seems to be mediated by how difficult they think the task is. When college is framed as independent, those students think that the task ahead is going to be much more difficult than when college is framed as a place where you can operate off of your interdependent self. In another study, we tried to look at other mediators. We looked at the cortisol response, and what we found is this first generation students, when you frame college as being a place for being independent and on your own, doing things in your own way, their cortisol spikes. This is this bar here, and that's not the case at all when you frame it as a place where you can operate from your interdependent self. So finally, some colleagues have done a belongingness intervention. This is Nicole Stevens and Mariam Hamadani, two former students who did a study at Northwestern University. And they did an intervention for 1 hour. They had two conditions. One was, and in each case they had half first generation students and half continuing generation students. In the, they set it up like this, in which the students were in the audience, and then there was a panel of 8 students. 3 of them were first gen and talked about being first gen at the university, and the others talked about being continuing generation. There was this panel, and then that was called the cultural education condition. And then there was another panel where all 8 students didn't refer to their social class background at all. They just talked about some being at college and academic challenges and tips and things that they had learned. And so we compared those two conditions. In the cultural education condition, we had those 3 students refer to the fact that they were working class, refer to the fact that this had been challenging for them, and then refer to how they'd been able to overcome that challenge as they discovered that other working class students also had these kinds of differences. Our focus here was on getting without saying it, to get students in the audience to understand, the participants, that there were 2 ways of being, and they may be not used to operating in a more independent way, and they should while they were at the university. So one student says, for example, I was the first in my family to go to college. I got here to Northwestern. I just didn't have a clue about how to do anything. For example, I was supposed to go to office hours, but I didn't want to go, and I didn't think I would have anything to say. But then I found out that office hours were cool. You could just go in there. You could ask any question. People were nice. They would help you. Another student said, I used to sit in my room when I didn't understand things and just try and get it, but I found out if you go to the TA, you'll find out lots of students don't understand it. So it was a sense of giving information that we think would allow them to feel entitled and empowered to ask. And what we found is, we were in this study, those in the cultural education condition here that says diversity here, we improved grades so that they match the continuing generation. In the panel where they listened to students just talk about tips for doing well academically after this 1 hour intervention. And one of the clear differences was in help-seeking behavior, such that those students, when we talked, they were exposed to some students naming their class and talking about how this had been a challenge and how they'd overcome it. They were much more likely to engage in help-seeking behavior. They felt entitled to do that. So they showed less anxiety and stress, and everybody showed more belongingness as a result. So I'm hurrying now because I want to stop. But my point here is that cultural mismatch is one source of the social class achievement gap. Our cultural intervention, education intervention improved the first gen's performance, and it helped all students. And what was key about this approach, and what's a different approach, is that you highlight the significance of the difference for your experience in college. Very often we try to be colorblind, class blind, culture blind. This intervention says, bring it up, talk about how it makes a difference, help students figure out how they can meet the challenge that the difference might make, give them strategies, they'll do just fine. And finally, this is the book cover from our new book that will be coming out in May that talks about a lot of these clashes. I talked about class here today. And then finally, I want to end with a thank you to my collaborators and thank you to you, to the audience. Thanks. So I'm really happy for questions. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about the pen studies,
Uh-huh.
Especially the one where you have the 4 pens of one color and then the
Mm-hmm.
one pen.
Mm-hmm.
This may have just been your manner of speaking about it, but you mentioned a couple of times that the students from the first generation wanted the common pen. I wonder if it's really that they want that pen or they're afraid to take the other one because they think it would be rude or presumptuous.
Well, I mean, that's a very good statement, because I'm, quickly, making an inference that because they chose it, they want it. I think that certainly what we know from, we've interrogated this lots more in East Asian context, people don't want the different one because they don't want to stand out. They don't want to be vulnerable or different, or they're not sure what message that would send. And I think for working class students, you're quite right. I mean, they're kind of, the first thing is, let me fit in here first. I don't want to do something that might make me stand out. So you're right, not that they wanted it. What I do know is when you ask people why you chose that pen, whoever you ask, they all give the same answer, which is, I like the color. So there's no, conscious awareness of it. Economists always say, well, people choose the unique one, but it's the scarce one, that's the best one. Well, yeah, but how come they don't choose that in these other contexts? So that the scarcity doesn't explain it. But yeah, good, very good point. Yes. Yes, go ahead.
I think that the studies you showed about the educational intervention, and just like the first generation's improvements that they made just overall in their college experience, that is so needed at Mizzou. Something like that, or programs that just address their needs, and just to help them understand, what the college experience is about, and also get their families involved.
Yes.
And I think addressing it in a letter, when they're accepted, that stuff's very needed initially, but then following through with programs, I don't know if you had any.
No, it's former student Nicole Stevens, who's been spearheading a lot of this work, is at Northwestern in the business school there, and so she's trying to work there with that university. At Stanford, Mariam Hamadani and I are trying to work with our people there, and people are kind of nervous because class is like one of those things like, ooh, don't talk about it. It's because we like to assume we're all middle class, or we like to just we just feel it's and it's out of this, I think, good motivation in that let's just treat everybody like equals. It's a very American thing, and that's an ideal that we want to be equal and treated as equals, but in fact our contexts set us up. We've had different experiences, and then we're meeting the way we can meet it and perform is very different. And so what's key, I think, is getting people to recognize it's okay to talk about these differences. And moreover, these differences aren't only a source of deficiencies. They're not only a source of, oh, well, you're not measuring up, you're doing things in the wrong way. There's a lot of resources that come from a working class way of being. A lot of working class students, these are going to be the strong students. If you give them a chance, they're going to be students, when things don't go their way the first time, they're not going to be crying about it. They're not going to be whining if they only get an A-. I mean, we all know those other students. Fire makes the steel tough, and that's kind of what's true in working class contexts. These are going to be some of our better students if we help people make the transition. But it's the same thing with race, ethnicity, like, ooh, don't talk about those differences too much, because people assume that's only going to make people feel bad. No, people know that their cultures are a source of meaning, motivation, strength. Bring it up and talk about what's good about it, but then you can also say, well, this might set up some problems, and here's what they would be. This asking for help one, and I was talking about this in the class earlier, so many first-generation students meet difficulty. What do? They sit in their room, look at their book, and try to figure it out all by themselves. This idea that they're entitled, because they're here and paying, to go out and ask for help. They're entitled to an education. They're entitled to go to the professor, to the TA, to whoever, and say, I don't get this. This doesn't make sense to me. Help me. I have a right to learn. Help me understand it. That's out of a middle class sense of, this is my place and I'm going to make some noise until somebody helps me. But a lot of working class students are under this sort of threat that maybe they don't measure up, so they hide. And someone needs to say, no, come out, this is how to do it. Yes?
I wondered, have you come across any counterintuitive type predictions that you might have tested? So, for example, it seems to me that the idea of joining a sorority or a fraternity is an interdependent act, and you at least should want to do that more if you're from the working class background. And then another example would be choosing a curriculum, a college that has a heavy core curriculum that everybody takes together, like St. John's and Annapolis.
Yeah, yeah.
Is there any?
No, that's good. I mean, I would suggest that, you know, kind of St. John's sort of thing, which tends to be for a lot of elite kids, would be actually very good for a lot of students from working class backgrounds. This is how we do it. This is what we expect you to learn. Do it in this order, I think would be a good idea. So that you know, that's a kind of thing that we could institute. We think, what's better than choice? And if some choice is good, more choice is better, and give students freedom. The sorority thing, I think, is interesting. It's very important, I think, for a lot of students of color to join sororities and fraternities. And although some people don't like that, I think it's very important to have a home away from home, or a place where people recognize what's going on. There's not, and can help you, you know, negotiate that. So I'm a big fan of ethnic themed dorms and houses and places within the university, because once you realize that you can have multiple selves and one self doesn't take away from the other self, then it makes sense that you can do that. I mean, so many university administrators are like, that would be divisive, we don't want to do that. But the whole rest of the university is the white themed dorm, you know. I mean, so it's like, but it's just getting comfortable with difference, and that difference doesn't, you know, mean a problem. Yeah.
When you were talking about students getting help, asking for help, and overcoming their fear of help, that's one way the university can respond. What about the comment you made earlier with your class environment, where the students felt uncomfortable that class required participation?
Yeah, well,
How can we respond and be more friendly?
I think we can say, look, you know, we're going to talk about this next week, and I'd like everybody to do two things. First, to write some things down that they're thinking, so you give people a chance to put in writing, and then you do kind of what I call, you know, warm calling. You tell them, next week I'm going to call on you and ask you about that, or, you know, next Thursday. So you give people a little prep, and that, you know, here's how you should be thinking about it. You know, just guide people to the idea that it'd be good for you to think about this. I'd like your own opinions, but spend some time thinking about it. But don't do the cold calling. Also, what really seems to work well is to break students in. You can often get better participation that way. But I think it's one of those educators' tricks. You know, if you just say, here's what the task is and here's how to do it. Most people can do it. What we make a mistake is assuming that everybody knows the task and they've had practice at it, and then we assume that the people who do it are smart and the ones that don't are dumb. So, you know, that's the part I'm trying to rail again. But I think once you tell people, here in the university, in some settings we expect you to be like this. We expect you to try to be a little bit individual and unique. We expect you to try to be a bit assertive, to try to have control and influence, and we expect you to choose and express your preferences when possible. If you tell them this is what's expected, and then you give them some strategies to meet it, it's not rocket science. And then I think the worst part is then we decide that the people who do it our way are the smart people, the good people. Yes.
Yeah, this is what I was wondering. I was thinking about, when you're talking about the culture, one could be we change the culture, or we change people to act in the culture. And it sounds like we're doing the latter, I guess, more so. And I'm wondering.
Perfect. No, that's what I would like to see. You know, the intervention I gave you was just this 1 hour thing. We worked first on people, telling students, here's what you can do. But I think what we need to do at the same time, and this kind of fits the theoretical framework, is we've got to change the interactions, the institutions. We have to change those practices so that all the burden of changing isn't on the student. Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And I think we can do it by small changes. Like, for example, my department, we talk about, you know, independent research project. Well, no research these days is independent, but we call it the independent research project. That's sort of scary to people, and we don't get very many people signing up. I think if we went out and said, would you join this team, this research team, if you have any interest in this? It's hard to get undergraduates from working class contexts to do research. They have no idea what that would be, why you would do it, what would be their role. So I think, some tweaks that aren't so difficult and aren't so expensive would be good. Yes?
I'm just very curious that you mentioned the working class and like the middle class, but I'm just curious if in your research, do you have some subsectors within the working class and middle class? I know that 1 hour lecture cannot include so many things, but I'm just, I noticed that you mentioned European students and European American students, Asian American students. So I'm just curious if the students in the middle class also have some interdependent kind of things in it. So do you have some subsectors?
Sure. I mean, and what I tried to just hint at that when I showed you this, which culture fosters which self, and so you can kind of do your own chart. I mean, if you're a middle class woman, you have some promoting of an independent self, but by virtue of being a woman, you also have some promoting of an interdependent self as well. I mean, if you're, I think African American samples are particularly interesting because you see really highly developed sense of independent self and a really highly developed sense of an interdependent self. There's sort of both selves that people have had practice in using. So it all depends what your combination of things are. If you're Asian, you're likely to have had a lot of practice with interdependence and see that as a viable way of being. And then, of course, if you come here in the US, you'll have exposure to this independent way of being. So I like to think of these things as, resources that people can carry around and use depending on their experience. And then, of course, you can, add to your complement of selves by getting in different environments or by moving. I mean, going to college is one way to foster your independence, but there's other ways. You can move to California where there's really so much focus on individuality and being your own person, and to complete lack of any social fabric, I would argue. But that's you really do see these differences push and pull in these different cultural contexts. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
What about the opposite?
Mm-hmm.
You're mentioning a lot, and if this may not necessarily be as applicable in terms of the definition of middle class and college educated, but actually, I think it would be very valuable of teaching independent individuals to be more interdependent. Because you say that empathy, working together, these are all positive.
Right, that's right, and those are resources that the working class students, they know about, and they have something to teach on that. And certainly as a society, I would argue that America better get its interdependent self more elaborated and more powerful and effective, or we're in big trouble here. I mean, just the climate change alone, if we don't figure out how to take others into account as we're acting and really elaborate this interdependence, we're all in trouble. But I think we have, I was telling in Ina's class, we were talking about that, and I was challenging the students to go out and look at the ads, listen to the songs they listen to, just stuff they see on the web. Is there anything that's fostering interdependence in American society? I don't think so. There's almost nothing. Everything leans towards, being a separate, special individual. I just saw the 3 new children's books that were reviewed in the New York Times last week. They're 3 books all about being special and unique and different. They all have the exact same theme. Even the reviewer noted that, are there no books that talk about, how you should connect to others and be responsive to others? And I think, we've lost that chord in American society. We certainly have it. We have it more here in the Midwest. We certainly had it in our history, but it's bad in some places. So very good question. Okay, yes.
Yeah. I just have a question as to, I'm a little bit older, like Glenn just had a lot of people in here. I was just kind of wondering, as you gradually grow older, do you move from being the independent self to the interdependent self? Because a lot of the traits that made me, like relatively successful come straight from the independent
Yeah,
self.
that's
and
right.
then as I grow older and I get a little more loving and mature and nurturing, I leave all those, which really serve me well, but as you mature, you need a closer relationship among other people.
Absolutely, and I think there's some work by my colleague Shinobu Kitayama that looks at actually with longitudinal data with Americans becoming more interdependent as they age, but showing that in comparison to East Asians who seem to be at a pretty high level of interdependence all the way through. I think that the our aging societies is going to be a problem because independence is so elaborated for us and so many people, that's the only way to be a person. And then of course when you can't be as independent, then it's like, oh, it's a deficiency, you're a failure, it's a really good comment and something I think as a society, but we've got to make interdependence be something strong. Very often it's seen as a weakness. And we have to know that adjusting to others, doing it, fitting in, compromising, doesn't mean you're weak. It doesn't mean you're wishy-washy or waffling. But that's how it's often cast. It's developing the we as social beings, we are we's and we are also I's. And I think my own take on this is there's too much on the I. I guess you agree with that too. Those of us who are getting on appreciate the interdependence here. But thanks for that comment.
That's a great note to end on. Thank you.